We will now hear about partial reinforcement in learning. And telling us about that is the director of the Queensland Brain Institute, affiliated professor of the School of Biomedical Sciences from University of Queensland, Australia. Welcome, Professor Pankaj Sah.
Well, thanks everyone. And look, it's wonderful to be in Lund again. And I spent almost 2 weeks here about 2 years ago, about the same time of year. We had a great time. And thank you so much for the invitation. It's been really very interesting bunch of talks so far. And so today, I added timing to it, given the everyone was changing the titles of their talks. So I thought, well, to fit in with the theme here. And what I'm going to do today is actually present you, I guess, one group, I call ourselves a group, one group's view on education and why we think, which direction we're headed, and what kinds of things we're trying to achieve, basically. And I'll present you some data, which is, all the data I'm going to present today is completely unpublished. It's being put together right now, and it comes from, I guess, a neurobiologist's perspective on a very social issue, if you like, and I'm going to have some suggestions at the end as to how I think this field ought to move. And of course, you know, I've done this before, and there's a lot of people in the audience often who completely disagree with me and think I'm completely wasting my time, and other people who buy in, and so I'd be curious to hear what people in the audience. And look, please feel free to interrupt me while we do have these talk sessions. I'm more than happy to argue with anyone about these things. So. And look, I'm going to do this from a neurobiology perspective. So, you know, people in this room are so many psychologists, and they probably know this as well as anybody else. But I'll present this from a biologist perspective, if you like. So, learning and memory are pretty obvious, right? A process of acquiring a skill or knowledge that leads to a change in behavior. And behavior is, I mentioned this particularly in terms of behavior rather than anything else, because this is the kinds of things we as experimentalists can assess, and whether your thoughts and perceptions change is another matter. And memory, of course, to retain and recover information from a previous experience. Okay, and education, so let's think about education, which is, and I often ask people, particularly when I'm speaking to teachers in Australia, which I seem to do a lot of, is that why do we bother with education? You know, why do we bother sending our kids to school? And, you know, maybe it would be just fine, you know, if they just stayed home and had homeschooling and stuff like that. But I guess, so a form of learning where skills, knowledge, ideas are transferred from one generation to another. Okay, and the idea really, at least, you know, what you're trying to do is prepare these people to produce a better society, so that when we're all dead and gone, you know, things continue on and are better, and they make better citizens, in a sort of largely speaking, okay? Also, of course, you want them to be productive and do good things for the world, okay? And learning and memory formation are absolutely critical to education, you know, and everybody in this room realizes this. If you couldn't learn things and remember things, you know, education is a complete waste of time. It's not going to work in general. Okay? So, you know, yesterday we talked about theories and we talked about ideas and how things work. So, learning and memory. So, there is a cellular theory about learning and memory. So, of course, the central nervous system is a vast network of connections, and which we're discovering every day. And you know, we at the Queensland Brain Institute are pretty much trying to understand circuits. So Carl, of course, in 1906, you know, was the guy who found neurons and found the connections between them. And he, in fact, was the first person to suggest that maybe learning has got to do with changes in the connections, strength of connections. Very, very prescient, way back in 1906. And you know, he got the Nobel Prize for discovering neurons along with Golgi. Of course, the whole idea of what might be going on comes from Donald Hebb, you know, who wrote this book called The Organization of Behavior. And in that, he talked about neurons that fire together, wire together, and this idea that cells which are working together in a particular task or a particular exercise, they wire up better together, and this is what happens during learning. And this is the Hebbian synapse. okay, for want of a better word. Okay? And that there are challenges to the heavy end synapse now, after many years of worrying about it, but nevertheless, there are these things called heavy end synapses. And there is a model for what a heavy end synapse might look like, and this is Tim Bliss, works in London, and Terry Lomo, and they discovered this thing called LTP, long-term potentiation, and this is a form of synaptic plasticity, okay? And this is actually a figure taken from this very famous paper of theirs in 1973, in which they described long-term potentiation in the rabbit hippocampus. And they were interested in the hippocampus because well known to be involved in learning and memory formation at the time. And what they're plotting here is the strength of one particular connection. And this is time in minutes. And so they stimulate this input, and you see it's pretty stable at 100%. And then they repetitively activate the system. All right? What they did was they repetitively activated it 4 or 5 times. And what they find an immediate change in synaptic strength, and it changes by about 50%. And this change is immediate, and it's stable. And what they showed was, in the next paper after this one, that if they implanted these rabbits with electrodes in their heads, and you could follow this for weeks on end, and it's well known now that if you initiate this plasticity in the hippocampus, it's pretty much stable for months and years on end, okay? So this is what LTP is about. So here's the idea. So here we have a cell, and here's an input. And this thing receives an external signal of some sort. Let's call it a stimulus of some sort. And this input is active at the same time. And as a result of this input changes the size. It changes the strength, all right? So this is the whole idea of what's supposed to be happening here. This strength is changing. And there's many, many ideas about what might be going on when it changes. And one of the intriguing things that it looks like it's some sort of a change in genetics in the cells that are concerned. There is certainly some changes in gene expression that go on to mediate this effect, okay? So here's the nervous system again. Okay, well, the idea is, here's experience, and let's call that you listening to me, or, tasting a glass of wine, or whatever you like, and as a result of that, some sets of connections change, okay, and in principle, this is happening by this mechanism that Hebb proposed and LTP. And this set of connections change. And, this is like 4 cells I've shown here, but normally we're talking about hundreds, maybe thousands. And the idea of memory is encoded in a pattern of connections. And this is called the engram. Okay? And the idea is that when you remember this experience, this engram is activated, and as a result of that, you retrieve this memory, okay? So let's just think about it, and I say to you, okay, 4 times 5, this engram gets activated by some mechanism, and we have absolutely no idea what that mechanism might be. And as a result of that, that same engram that was turned on when you were, however age you were, when you learned what 4 times 5 was, that thing gets switched on, and you remember the answer, okay? So that's the whole idea of what's going on. So synaptic plasticity is really the prevailing cellular model for learning, and realistically, there is no other theory out there. And, and this is a testable theory. We talked about testable theories. And, my view on theories in neuroscience, of course, you have a theory, it has to make testable predictions, and a testable prediction being one where you can go and says, just like in physics, if you change this set of connections, this will change, all right? And, of course, today, 2019, with the advent of genomics and all the different viral techniques, which we can talk about in the discussion session, people are starting to do this, all right? Where you take the engram, you can create it anew, or you can disrupt the engram, and it seems to disrupt the right memories, okay? Using very simple things. Okay, so here's education now. Here's the classroom. And to take this to the classroom, here's student's head. And this is the teacher. Something happens inside the head, an engram is created. And out of that, you get output. Answers, changes in behavior, all right? So this is the sort of system which we think is going on, okay? And, if The mechanisms, of course, are different, but in general, that's the idea of what's happening, okay? So learning. So our centers, what we did, okay, so education, my background's in health, and I was trained as a medic and worked in health for a while. And really, when you think about education, from the perspective of the people involved in the Science and Learning Research Center, certainly in Australia, right? Let's talk about Australia for a minute, which is where I come from. Education is a bit of a basket case, right? When I say, look, there's a harsh words, but why is it a basket case? In terms of outcomes of education, all right, kids, let's say kids, and let's talk about two separate things. One is how well are kids doing in terms of after they go through their high school years and emerge into university. Nothing has changed in the last 15 years. Absolutely zip, right? Those kids are performing just the same way now as they did 15 years ago. Comparison to health, it's like night and day, right? And it's the same in any first world country you look at, where we live longer. If tomorrow you get sick, you get antibiotics. It used to be the case that when I was a medical student, if you had a blood disorder, you pretty much 80% death rate if you had a leukemia of some sort. Now, there's a survival rate of nearly 90%. Okay, that's a long time ago, but nevertheless, those things have happened. Education, nothing has changed, all right? In Australia, we have these indigenous populations, and of course, just like in many other countries, there's a big gap between educational outcomes of indigenous kids and non-indigenous kids. The government has poured millions of dollars into education, of billions of dollars over years. That gap has not shifted one iota, all right? It's the same difference now as it was 15, 20 years ago. And, this is pretty shameful, I think, right? Okay, so here's where we come from. So animal models, okay, I'm going to talk about animal models. Animal models provide the basic science that underpins learning. And really, I think the science that underpins learning is pretty difficult to do in people. And why is that? And really, that's because you can't cut open people's heads. You can't take bits out. You can't disrupt them. You could, I guess, but nobody's going to buy into this idea. And you can't realistically change anything in people, all right? You can use things like TMS, but they're pretty harsh, all right? Behavioral experiments and psychology, which is a lot of you guys are from this area, allows us to test specific ideas in people, ideas that come from the animal world, all right? And this happens all the time in health and medicine. This is exactly the system that operates in health, all right? Now, imaging, which we have heard about imaging, and electrophysiology, in its many, many guises, whether it's using event potentials or EEGs, whatever you like, provides insight into mechanisms and provides the feedback to animal models, okay? So the idea really is you have an animal model, you do some experiments, from that you go to the psychologists who do the behavior and that type of stuff, you do the electrophysiology, and from that you make a prediction which you test in an animal model, right? That's the direction that we would like to see us going. And of course, in the real world, let's talk about education, you need schools, all right? Education is basically a social activity, and, it's unlikely that's going to change. Despite the advent of the digital revolution, the idea that we're going to stop sending kids to schools is not going to happen. And I think pretty much, I would imagine that most people here would agree that whatever happens in the classroom, apart from those Hebbian synapses which are changing, the teacher and the interactions, it's a social activity, right? And really, it's no much good sitting in a classroom, in a laboratory and coming up with ideas and saying, oh, well, we're just going to implement this now. You really need to work with the schools. You just have to. There's just no choice, I don't think, all right? And Eric yesterday talked about this as well, okay? So the Science and Learning Center has 25 chief investigators. It was established in 2013, and it's a collaboration between psychology, education, and neuroscience, okay? And then we have a bunch of partners. So the partners, firstly, is the Departments of Education in the different states in Australia. Now, This is a critical partner, and Eric talked about this yesterday when he was talking about his wish list, what he wanted to do, work with government, all right? And really, this is something that taken us a bit of time to understand. Talking to politicians is very difficult, and it's very slow, lots of cups of tea, and very, very protracted. But without this, I mean, I really don't know how it works in Sweden, but in Australia, you cannot implement any change without them being on board 100%, okay? It just won't happen. We engage with Catholic education. These are people who provide a large part of the education sector in Australia. This is the private school system. We engage with the Gunmiller Foundation, which is a foundation that looks after Indigenous kids. And I won't talk about this today, but we can talk about it in the discussion session. In terms of educational outcomes for Indigenous kids, we work with these guys and start talking to women who are pregnant long before the kids are born in terms of improving educational outcomes. That's the kind of thing that's come out of the SLRC. Okay, and there's a network of schools. So we've gone to the schools and directly engaged with the schools. So what we don't do is go and show up and say, oh, all right, here's an idea. We get them to come on board from day one. So there's 16 schools in Queensland so far, and there's 10 schools in Victoria, and there's about 10 in South Australia as well. So that's nearly 40 schools throughout Australia now. And what we try to do is implement programs along with the schools, all right? And any implementation really involves the teacher doing the implementation rather than us going into a single person coming in or a bunch of them, okay? So the laboratory, we set up an educational neuroscience class. This is an experimental classroom at the University of Queensland. And this is the classroom which houses up to 8 students, and they get hooked up with EEG monitors. We track their eyes. The same kind of experiments we've heard from a lot of people in the last day or so, and measure EEG, and they get lessons on a computer. All right? This is just measuring physiological measurements during learning. Next door to this classroom is the Centre for Advanced Imaging, which has a human 3T and a 7T scanner, and it's got an animal scanners as well. So experiments that are done in laboratories in QBI, and some of the kids who go through the experimental classroom, they get scanned in here. Now, the other thing which I'm not going to talk about today is our center. We are not just interested in the kids and how they learn, we're pretty interested in the teachers as well. We're very interested in how they teach and the things that bother them. For want of a better word, things that bother them. So one of the first projects that we did was on maths anxiety in preschool teachers, okay, and developing programs for teachers. And really, you know, I keep coming back to health because that's my background, but just the same as health, you can't ignore the doctors and just think about the patients. It's the same deal here. You can't ignore the teachers and just think about the students and what goes on between them, okay? And we have a cyclotron in-house. We make our own PET ligands as well, so we can do PET scanning on some of these people as well. So it's a pretty overall interesting exercise. There's also a learning interaction classroom, which is a very large classroom, which is equipped with high-definition audio and video, and this is to test students in a classroom. And this has been used a lot by people in Australia, but also quite a few people internationally coming and working with us. While this has been good, it hasn't really worked. And it hasn't really worked because when the students come, their proper classes come there with their teacher, but it's like an excursion for the kids, and the whole social context changes. And they behave very differently, okay? So this is changing now. The University of Queensland, turns out, is building a high school. It's going to have kids from grade 6 all the way to grade 12. And in this school, we're installing an experimental classroom, which will be a regular classroom. Okay, so which will give us the place to do these kinds of experiments. And it's a regular school. This is nothing special about it. It's just a school, but the university is building one. Okay, so I'm going to give you just one single example of the kinds of directions, how you can use this kind of system, all right? So here's learning. You have information skills, and that's stored in memory, which then undergoes a period of consolidation, and then, the engram gets set up. And of course, there's testing and recall, all right? And this is the test kids get, okay? And this is another area I'm not going to talk about too much. There's a bunch of people in the center very keen to get rid of exams in schools. There's a strong feeling among a lot of the people in our center that the way we assess kids now by giving them these exams once a year or 5 times a year, it really just gives you a snapshot of what's going on. And depending on what the kid happened to them yesterday or what side of the bed they got out of on, they behave differently. And so pretty interested to find better ways of testing and evaluation. And this is another reason you've got to talk to government, all right? They, of course, hate it, okay? They don't like this idea at all. And why are people thinking this? They're thinking this because a study was done, at the University of Queensland, where an assessment was done. So kids, when they finish high school in Australia, get an OP score in Queensland. It's called the overall performance, and it's a ranking of all the students, all right? They get ranked, and if you want to do medicine, you have to be in the top 1% ranking, and if you want to do veterinary science, you have to be somewhere else, and so forth. An analysis was done of kids with different OP scores and how well they performed 10 years after they left university, all right? And there's zero correlation, all right? So the OP doesn't give you any indication of how well you're going to perform. Okay? There's no question if you train as a medic, you earn a lot more money than if you train as an artist, all right? But nevertheless, the OP score is not, and the OP score is determined by tests. So, okay, the brain is a prediction machine, as we've heard about today. So here's your memory of something, okay? You perform an action, and we're talking about now an exam process, all right, or a learning process. And then there's a prediction that you make, depending on your memory, on what this action achieved, all right? And out of this, there's an error. There's an error signal. So what happens to the error signal? Firstly, you realize an error, you can renew or reconsolidate this memory. Okay, this memory is not fixed in time, and we know this from the biology, and it can change the memory, all right? The other impact is there's an emotional response to this error signal, and from this there's a physiological response. Dopamine changes, cortisol changes, and so forth. And this also can affect the memory, okay? Now, these signals here come from the feedback, okay? And I don't know if many of you have read John Hattie's books on feedback on education. The biggest effect on educational outcomes is feedback that kids are given. Not just kids, but anyone who's learning any sort of training exercise, okay? So the idea is, here's the feedback loop. You teach something, you test them, you provide feedback, and this loop goes back and forth, all right? And this is what determines how well you teach, how well outcomes are. So the question is, what kind of feedback should you give? What's the best way? And how do you decide when to give it? And so why does it work? Okay, why does feedback work? Okay, we've heard about this morning as well. So reinforcement. Feedback is all about reinforcement, right? So there's a stimulus of some sort. Let's say I ask you a question. This is time, there's a behavior, and out of this, there's the feedback. Yes, you got it right, you got it wrong. In the old days, you got the strap, or whatever where you wanted to go, right? Or you give them, a cookie if you get it right, whatever you like. And out of that, there's a behavioral change. Now, this reinforcement can have a schedule, all right? It can be a continuous reinforcement schedule, for instance. Okay, so each time you get something right, you say, okay, well done, Joey, here's a cookie. And this is often done in primary school in Australia. Every time a kid does something, they get a little drawing of some sort, or the teacher gives you a little prize, or whatever you like. The alternative is an intermittent schedule, all right, where you reinforce it occasionally, not all the time. So the question I want to ask is, what's better, all right? What is the better way to go here? Should you continuous reinforcement or partial reinforcement? We'll come back to where this is heading, all right? So how do you go about studying something like this, all right? So what we did is we used a very simple Pavlovian task, fear conditioning. We're thinking about mechanism now, a theory as to how this works, all right? So many of you are psychologists, I'm sure you've heard about fear conditioning, and this is an aversive system, but it can be appetitive as well, where you can be giving rewards. It works pretty much the same way. And of course, fear conditioning, a Pavlovian system, you have a conditioned stimulus, which can be a tone, or a sound, or a smell, or whatever you like. And that's paired contingently with an unconditioned stimulus, which is aversive in this case, a foot shock. But it could just as well be a reward, right? Works pretty much the same way. And here's a response that you measure. And this response, when you play the CS, is pretty stable, okay? Then there's an acquisition phase, when you pair the two together. Of course, this is what Pavlov did. You have an acquisition period, and your conditioned response gets bigger. Okay, and you can come back, you can test this sometime later. And in an aversive system, okay, you can do it with people, you can do it with animals, it all works exactly the same. You pretty soon learn that this stimulus, which was neutral to begin with, is now predicting an aversive event or an appetitive event, and you learn this response, and you respond to it accordingly, all right? And in this case, it might be animal is freezing, or his heart rate goes up, or something like that. And this is long-lasting, right? You can condition animals or people today, and you can test them a year later. It works just fine. Okay, now, if you come back at some point later and you play the CS again and again, okay, they have this thing called extinction, where you pretty soon learn that this stimulus is no longer going to give you a reward, it's no longer aversive, and your response goes down slowly. And this extinction is very interesting. So extinction in the Pavlovian sense, all right, is just removing that association between the CS and the US, all right? But this is also accounts for things like forgetting, okay, where you learn something due to a system where you're taught something, okay, and then if you don't get that response or the reward to it, so you slowly don't perform nearly as well, all right? Which is one of the reasons, why sports people are practicing all the time, all right? If you don't practice, you do forget those things, all right? Of course, it comes back quickly next time you learn it, but despite that, you do forget this, okay? So the circuits that underpin this are pretty well understood, all right? Here's fear conditioning. There's a tone and a foot shock, and it's pretty well known that the amygdala is the centerpiece of all of this. These inputs, and we can talk about these circuits, are really well known, and this is what my lab does, by the way. We trace these circuits in animals. So here's the signal for the CS and the US. They come together in the amygdala, and this is what's supposed to happen in there. There's a Hebbian synaptic change going on in the amygdala because these two signals, remember I told you those two signals come onto single cells. This is happening in the amygdala, all right? And the output is the learned behaviors, all right? So in the classroom, of course, it's a very similar system. You don't know where this is. It's not the amygdala for many things, but this is, what's 2 plus 2? And here's the teacher telling you, yes, it's 4, whatever you like. And Hebbian system in place here. Okay, and for fear conditioning, in the learned response, this is the input we know is undergoing Hebbian plasticity. We know this, we know particular which cells are undergoing it, all right? What's interesting is during the learned response, these two, medial prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, just like in people in terms of memory, these two systems get engaged during the learned response. This is known pretty well as well, okay? And I'll come back to the medial prefrontal cortex and hippocampus. And this is to produce the output, if you like. Okay? So in fear conditioning, this is what's typically done. 100% reinforcement, all right? Every time there's a tone, there's a foot shock. But of course, here's a partial system where with a 25% reinforcement or a 50% reinforcement, all right? Now, these experiments are all done by this guy, John Morris, who is a PhD student at my lab. So what would you think would happen, all right? It's interesting thinking about this. So during the learning procedure, when you pair the two, okay, and this is, let's say, in a classroom, you're saying yes, no to things. Okay, during the acquisition, here's comparing 100% reinforcement with 50%, all right? And it turns out animals, and we've done this in people as well, you learn just fine. There's no difference to learning, all right, whether you reinforce them in a continuous reinforcement schedule or a partial. In fact, 50%, you really are indistinguishable, all right? Here's Extinction, if you like, over many, many, many trials. This is 28 trials where the CS is played again and again and again, all right? Here's the 100% and the 70% reinforced system, which it's undergoing extinction. But in the 50% system, they really are resistant to this extinction phase, all right? These animals are resistant. They don't forget things nearly as well, okay? We'll come back to this in a minute as to what is going on here. Okay, so remember I told you this learning at this point in time here was due to an effect of Hebbian plasticity, all right? And during this phase of forgetting, if you like, or during extinction, these Hebbian synapses are presumably disappearing, okay? So here's a bit of cell biology. So this is what we've done here is we fear condition these animals with two sets of models and cut their brains out. We stained the amygdala for phosphor-ERK. Phosphor-ERK is a protein which marks cells which have undergone plasticity, all right? It's, you can use FOS, that's the other marker. These are both immediate early genes. Remember I told you learning involves some sort of changes in gene transcription. This is the amygdala, this is the basolateral and central amygdala. And these black dots are standing for phosphor-ERK, all right? So here's 100% reinforcement, and these, you can see some black dots here. But in the 50% reinforcement, it's pretty clear there's lots and lots more of these black dots, all right? For whatever reason, in the partially reinforced system, you have tons more plasticity going on, all right? And we really don't know why right now, but it's pretty clear that in terms of the fact that animals learn better, they remember things better, and there's more plasticity, all that hangs together, all right? And here's some of the quantification of this, and this is phosphor-ERK, and then the black bars, there's FOS in the amygdala, and it happens in the hippocampus as well, all right, both places. So the upshot of this experiment is now we have a theory as to what's going on during partial reinforcement. For whatever reason, these animals, the learning is tons better, okay? And you just remember, this is a predictive system we're dealing with, all right, as to what might be going on here. And both the amygdala and the hippocampus, both regions which are involved in the recall of this system, are showing lots more plasticity, all right? So the last thing we did was we stuck electrodes in these animals' heads and measured field potentials in the amygdala and the hippocampus. And this is a power spectrum of activity produced by the conditioned stimulus, all right? Just not worry about these peaks. Just think of, this is what I call, this is a theta peak. That theta is well known to be involved with learning, all right? So what I want you to look at is these numbers here. This is the power of this peak, all right? And these numbers go from 0 to 10 millivolts squared per hertz, okay? This is the 100% reinforced system. In the 50% reinforced, this theta power is really 10 times bigger, all right? So basically, this whole plastic system is tons more responsive in the partially reinforced system, okay? This is an amygdala. Here's the hippocampus. Same deal, okay? So the conditioned stimulus, that is the thing that this animal's trying to learn. Okay, well, in our world of worlds, what we'd like to think that if you were teaching someone, let's say, I don't know, equations or fractions, if you partially reinforce them in the classroom, then the signals that are associated with this learning would be a lot bigger and better under that system. And here's the coherence between the BLA and the hippocampus. This is the 50% system and the 100% system. There's tons more coherence, okay? The hippocampus, which is where the memories are originally formed, is driving this memory, and this is tons stronger. It's, it's about 50% better, basically, okay? So the upshot from this is, look, from an animal model, Extinction is resistant following partial reinforcement. So the idea here would be that if you're going to reinforce kids in a classroom, okay, you're better off doing it in a partial system, all right? They're lot less likely to forget, a lot more likely to remember these facts, okay? And hippocampus is engaged during partial, so that's by the by, okay? So imagine you're this animal, all right? And I'm just trying to think about what might be going on here. So you heard a tone or a voice, and you get a foot shock, and you learned that this tone is now aversive, and you learn to respond to it, right? And this happened here. And during the learning procedure, in the 50% system, just think about the 50% partial reinforced system. You heard this tone, and sometimes you got a shock, and sometimes you didn't, all right? And out of this, you learn that, oh shit, this tone is aversive, I'm going to get a shock. And I've had this done to myself. You can do this in people really easily. You put a little strap on someone's arm, and you give them a 9-volt battery attached to it, and you get a shock. And you play a tone and a shock, and you pretty soon learn that this tone is going to predict the shock, and your pupils dilate, your skin conductance goes up. Same things happen to people. It was actually done with babies a long, long time ago, which you can't do anymore. And so think about, once you've learned this, at some point in the future, you play the tone again, all right, to this animal or to yourself. So what do you do now, right? So during the learning procedure, sometimes you got a shock and sometimes you didn't. So you might think, oh shit, I'm going to get the shock anyway. So you respond with this response, all right? But then the second time the tone comes on, now you're not so certain anymore, right? Because during the learning process, of course, sometimes the shock came and sometimes didn't. In the 100% system, when every time the tone came, you got a shock during the learning part of it, you would think, oh, okay, this is not so bad anymore. But now you can't be so certain, all right? And this is, I think, what is happening here, that the predictive system is misperforming, if you like, all right? And which is why this extinction memory, so you take the safest bet, if you like, for want of a better word, right? You say, okay, you may as well think you're going to get a shock, and which is why you just keep responding thinking that this is going to be a fearful event, okay? And this is, of course, putting a very human perspective on this, right? But this is what we think is going on here. Okay, in people, here's 2 people now. This is skin conductance ratio, and we've only done it in 2 patients, two basically people taken from the laboratory and undergone a 50% fear conditioning and 100%, and the skin conductance is tons higher. So these people are expecting the shock to be coming a lot more. And we'll do a few more of this, but this has been done with an appetitive system before, and it works in people just fine. So we're trying to replicate this in people, okay? So the next step, partial reinforcement in learning, so feedback in the classroom. So the plan really for us is what we're going to try in classrooms is in grade 1 and grade 2, and again, it's going to be in arithmetic. And again, with these schools we've got, looking to see if you provide a partially reinforcement to this, do kids perform better, all right? In fact, they learn faster. How often and what's the nature of the feedback? That's something which we're talking about now. What do? Do you give them cookies? Do you give them a picture? Do you say yes? Or do you just simply ignore them some of the time, all right? So you do a test, but you don't give them any feedback. It's not so straightforward as to what you should be doing next. Okay, translation. So what are we trying to achieve in the long term? So here is our wish list for translation, if you like. Okay? What we're really looking to do is to produce better outcomes for students in the long term. And the long term being, from the perspective of the science of learning, what we'd like to do is to have interventions in place in grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, and we want to look to see what happens when these kids start high school, to see what the difference is between kids who underwent one program versus another, Okay. What we want to do is have a change in policy. Policy on how things happen in schools, but also in teacher training. And for the teacher training side, we've already started doing this. At the University of Queensland, where there's a Masters of Neuroscience of Education, which, it's not compulsory, but after you've done your Bachelor of Education, you can do a Masters of Neuroscience of Education. And these people learn about those three things: psychology, neuroscience, and how you put the three together, okay? What we'd like to do is this translation, and I talked about this briefly yesterday. We would like to establish a consortium, just like in health, okay? A consortium where we agree, say this partial reinforcement system is one possibility, okay? Where you say, okay, let's just trial this in classrooms and do it in, let's say, 5 countries, all right? Where we come to an agreement how exactly we're going to do it. And if it turns out it doesn't work, well, you have to rethink your whole strategy, all right? We think it's going to work, but it might not, all right? We're looking for outcomes, and what do we want at the end of this? We want guidelines as to how you do this kind of thing in the classroom. A specific set of guidelines which can be used during teacher training, okay? So and we've started talking to a bunch of people. This is not easy to do, and it's expensive. Why is it expensive? It's expensive from the data collection side, and it's expensive from getting guidelines through various places, right? And many of you have done this, and you realize, you need funding for it, is what it comes down to. And we have started talking to people about, and there are agencies out there, none of them which are government-based, who are interested in funding a program like this. But look, if you're interested, come and talk to me, or send me an email, and if you're even vaguely interested in participating in this, we certainly have people in Singapore, in Hong Kong, and in Brazil already in place who are interested in participating, okay? So the other side that comes out of this journal, and let me do a sort of a pitch for our journal, if you like. There's a journal called The Science of Learning, and this journal is a very broad journal. It's a partner journal with Nature, and it's broad in the sense that we really think that in terms of getting outcomes in education, you really need to be running programs in the animal world and the human world together. Okay, you need to have partnerships in this, and the two groups have to be talking to each other. And this is the place to do it. Here's the kinds of things we publish, So this is a review of the Montessori education, which is just about education. And here's a biologically based neural circuit modeling for fear learning and extinction. Right? So we're interested in all sorts of articles to do with learning. And to start the conversation going, to think not just from the animal cellular side, but also think about how you translate this into the real world. And we are pretty much reductionists in terms of education. I said education is social activity, but it's not the same as teaching someone how to manage economics of a country. What goes on in classrooms, at least in those formative years, is pretty much a straightforward learning exercise, all right, for most kids. There's also community pages where people can talk about issues that are confronting them and what they're doing. So just have a look, and if you're interested, you can. It's like a place for doing a blog, if you like. So I'll stop there. So thank you very much for your attention. And of course, the funding for this thing comes from the Australian Research Council and the NHMRC in Australia. Thanks for your attention.